So my name's Cynthia Walker. I'm the director here at the Brickstore Museum. I'm assisted at the panel here today. You could hear her voice by Deb Williams, who's a very helpful program coordinator for this session or series. And she'll be watching in the chat if you have any questions. Oops. Little pop-up. Today we are kicking off the museum's series called Your Old House and Other Preservation Stories, a virtual series that explores various topics in historic preservation. Especially here in Kennebunk, but like much of Maine and the nation, we boast, by my judgment, over 200 historic homes and structures, at least that. So historic preservation is a constant here in our community. Even the museum is housed in 5 historic buildings, which we are constantly working to maintain. So the idea for this series came up because of all the knowledgeable professionals that we get to work with, and we thought we'd bring them to you. Excuse me, this virtual series is offered for free, but obviously donations are always gratefully accepted to support the ongoing programming here at the Brickstore Museum, which you can do online at brickstoremuseum.org/support. Please also visit our website's calendar to see other items coming up. .org/support.
Oh, so sorry.
That's okay. I didn't recognize that is my own voice, so that was confusing. So coming up, we have an event to celebrate our founder, Edith Barry. She is celebrating her 140th birthday in March. So we'd love you to join us for that and learn a little bit more about her. We have a Maine fiddling exhibition that's opening next week. That is pretty exciting. And we'll have a big 2-band concert on April 17th for the whole community to share in. So please go explore on our website and find out what else we're doing. To close out the next session to follow the next session in our preservation series is on Thursday, March 21st at noon, featuring Bryce Waldrop, who's a preservation architect and historian, who will focus on how to date your home and help you understand how to use historic records to better understand the story of your house. You can sign up as you did for this session on our website calendar. Just a note as we go through our presentation today, if you have any questions as we go along and you don't want to forget them, you are welcome to put them in the chat and we will read them out at the Q&A portion of the session at the end. And then when there is time for questions at the end, you're also welcome to unmute yourself if you'd like to be able to ask your question in person. So now on to our speaker today. Brad Miller is the preservation manager at Maine Preservation. Prior to coming to Maine, he worked with Indiana Landmarks, the country's largest statewide historic preservation nonprofit organization. There he served as director of the Northwest Field Office, where he assisted communities, local governments, and property owners in preserving historic buildings in a 4-county region. Sounds like very talented and multi-talented. Prior to his work in Indiana, Brad worked with the Somerville, Massachusetts Historic Commission and the Tennessee Civil War National Heritage Area. He holds an MA in Public History from Middle Tennessee State University and a BA in History from Gettysburg College. Brad, welcome.
Thank you so much, Cynthia. I also have a dog at my feet, so we'll see how that works out. Thank you to the Brickstore Museum for the invitation, and thank you all for joining us today. Hopefully we all remain connected as the blustery day continues outside. Going to go ahead and turn on my presentation here. And I have the great honor of kicking off the workshop series about preservation, and I hope I'll do it justice of providing a kind of a large overview for everyone today. So as Cynthia mentioned, my name is Brad Miller. I'm the preservation manager at Maine Preservation. Just a quick overview of what I'll be talking about today. I'll introduce our organization, take you all through a brief history of historic preservation in the United States, talk about what that means today and how we kind of view and operate within the preservation field. Briefly mention a few topical examples of preservation in Kennebunk today, and then gladly answer any questions that you may have throughout the course of the presentation at the end. So we'll leave plenty of time for that to happen. So first, who are we? So Maine Preservation, we're a statewide historic preservation nonprofit. Our mission: we promote and preserve historic places, buildings, downtowns, and neighborhoods, strengthening the cultural and economic vitality of Maine communities. So how do we do that? So we do that through 5 program areas. Our first is technical assistance. So this is our hands-on, on-the-ground guidance to property owners, whether that's private homeowners, local governments who own historic buildings, or nonprofits like the Brickstore Museum that steward these important places across Maine. We also offer financial assistance and support. So we gladly help all these all these property owners seek the financial support that is out there for preserving and rehabilitating historic buildings and sites. And we also administer a small capital improvement grant fund for nonprofits who steward buildings as part of their community-driven work. Probably the most important aspect of our mission is education and outreach. So just like what I'm doing today is spreading the news and knowledge of historic preservation to all the people of Maine, to talk about its benefits and how it can be a part of your own community and world. A fun part of our program in education is our annual Jane's Walk, which is our free citizen-led tours of things of interest in your community, whether that's old buildings or infrastructure or, perhaps a walk through the woods. And that's the first Saturday of May this year. So look out for more information on that. Stewardship. So we also take a pretty direct role in some historic properties through our preservation easement program. So preservation easements, much like a conservation easement, are legal agreements and documents that allow us to oversee and steward historic buildings while they're owned by private property owners. And our largest easement is the Sabbathday Lake Shaker Village in New Gloucester, which was made up of 16 buildings. And then finally, we advocate for programs and legislation that support historic preservation, whether that's up at the State House in Augusta or in Washington, D.C. So currently we're advocating for a couple different pieces of legislation in Augusta, including LD 1810, which would enhance our current state tax credit for small downtown buildings, like pictured here, like in Eastport, but also to create a homeowner tax credit for homeowners who own historic buildings. And certainly I wouldn't be a good historian if I didn't first root us in the origins of the preservation movement in the United States. But to first do that, we have to look across the pond to Western Europe. So some of these early modern ideas of preservation go back to some early restorers of buildings. So Viollet-le-Duc was a French architect working in the early to mid 19th century, restoring many of France's medieval cathedrals. So his focus were on these grand, majestic landmarks. And he began to develop a theory to rebuild these landmarks as they should have been, meaning to restore it by preserving and repairing it, but also by trying to recreate, in his mind, what it once looked like. Unfortunately, today we look back at this perspective and think about how some of those works he actually added details that never existed. So he was doing things based on pure conjecture. Over in England, 19th century English writer and critic John Ruskin was developing his own thoughts through restoration. A lot of those thoughts were kind of worked through in his 7 Lamps of Architecture. And Ruskin, he felt that buildings should not be restored and should instead remain untouched. Quoting him, Ruskin, "The greatest glory of a building is not in its stones or in its gold, its glory is in its age." So Ruskin's thought was, it's really the patina and the layers of history that have accumulated on a building or a site that are important to its very essence and identity, and therefore we should really just kind of maintain those things that have already been in place and maintain its patina. But over in the United States, these early preservations also were focusing on these kind of grand, these landmarks of grand significance. And so a lot of folks in preservation look back to the 1850s and a local movement by affluent women to help preserve George and Martha Washington's Mount Vernon. So preservation was very much, early preservation at least, was very much this practice by affluent, well-to-do people who were looking to preserve places of people of great importance, like George Washington, the founder of our country. So this group petitioned Congress, unfortunately unsuccessfully, to save the building. Instead, they formed the Mount Vernon Ladies Association in 1853, and were able to successfully preserve Mount Vernon, which you can visit today. But also, as this kind of movement of focusing on buildings of significance and kind of individual landmarks, slowly this idea progressed of looking towards the collective. So thinking about whole neighborhoods and communities. And so in 1931, Charleston, South Carolina, there was a movement afoot to create a historic district. And they were actually credited with creating the first preservation ordinance at the local level. And this was in reaction to a proposal to build a gas station in their city center, as well as kind of this widespread destruction of historic homes. And so this is seen as the very first kind of local initiative, local legal initiative to help preserve historic buildings. And you also see, I mentioned Edith Cleaves Berry, establishment of the Brickstore Museum, trying to place, again, these kind of national trends back here in Maine. But really what was kind of the inflection point in preservation was rather its reaction to something. So, and that's urban renewal. So the impact of 2 decades of economic recession, the booming post-war economy, a housing shortage, kind of paired federal legislation to address these issues. These all triggered a massive change in our nation's built environment. The most detrimental of impacts came from urban renewal, primarily through efforts of blight clearance and the construction of more roads and highways. Pictured here is the destruction that took place on the peninsula in Portland to make way for the Franklin Arterial, which connects 295 to downtown Portland. I always like to reference the writer turned activist Jane Jacobs, who wrote about her experience with urban renewal in New York City's Greenwich Village. She wrote about this in The Death and Life of Great American Cities, through her successful efforts to prevent a highway going through Greenwich Village. And Jacobs really highlights that while it's important to preserve the historic buildings for their significance, but they're also, these efforts to destroy communities were ripping at the very fabric of our neighborhoods and the places that we lived and worked and lived with, and kind of culture lived. And so not only should we preserve buildings for buildings, but also for the people that live and work in them. So while urban renewal kind of took whole swaths of our communities, they were also destroying kind of individual prominent landmarks. A great example locally is Portland's Union Station, which came down in 1961. This became a breaking point for many places. In Portland, this eventually led to the founding of Greater Portland Landmarks, a nonprofit that still exists today, as well as bolstered larger efforts across the state of Maine, including our own founding of Maine Preservation in 1972, which we originally were the Citizens for Historic Preservation. And this reaction to urban renewal and the need to kind of reestablish the balance between progress and preservation of our national fabric kind of resulted in the passage, ultimately, of the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. And it was this law that really kind of established the framework for preservation in our country today. So I'd like to pause right here as we pivot to what I regard as kind of the contemporary preservation movement or the preservation field today. We remain focused on the preservation of important landmark buildings, intact historic districts, and maintaining a sense of place and community interwoven into the historic fabric of our towns and cities. But how the ways we kind of everyone approaches preservation are now vastly different and many. And so if you're willing to share, I'd be interested to know, what historic preservation is to you all. If you'd like to share in the chat, what values do you think it provides to your community?
Memory in 3 dimensions.
Great, yeah. So definitely these places provide us the physical, tangible site of history, things that are embedded in the architecture and the actual fabric, definitely. I'm fully on board with that. That's one of the reasons I got into preservation. I think place-based learning is very important. Well, as we move forward, if you feel that I may have mentioned something that you feel strongly about preservation, feel free to put it in the comments, and we can take it as a comment during the Q&A, or maybe it's formed as a question.
We have one more, preserving the history and culture of our roots in shipbuilding.
Oh, great. Okay. Yeah, and a lot of times these places, like the homes of ship captains or those who worked on the boats, really are what we have left of that kind of history, as not many of the original boats persist.
We have another one, comprehensive plan and impact.
Awesome. Yeah. And so we'll definitely get into that. I'll get into that a little bit later, of thinking about preservation as a way of a framework of looking at how we plan for the future. How do we take into account these places? How do we monitor change and kind of allot for progress while still staying rooted in the past? Awesome. We'll keep those ideas flowing, and I'll be happy to talk about them at the end and hear from you all. So thinking about, the different ways in which people approach preservation, at its core, preservation is about repairing and reusing what we already have. The sites and structures that are already kind of integrated in part of our cities, our towns, our villages. And these buildings, as economies change and communities change, these unused buildings can quickly become a blight unless you can turn them and pivot and see them as assets. And so the framework of preservation can really think about what are the economics of preservation. So a great example just north of Kennebunk is the York Manufacturing Mill Number 4 building on the Saco River, which just a few years ago was rehabilitated and is now Saco Mill Number 4, and what was this kind of vacant, underused building has been transformed through preservation efforts into 150 market rate apartments with 30,000 square feet of commercial space. So again, instead of allowing this building to be a blight, it has been repurposed and reused and rehabilitated, and is now a contributing part of the local economy in Biddeford and Saco. Thinking about our downtowns, so the Main Street program, which some of you all may be familiar with, emerged in the 1970s, kind of at that early stages of preservation, and came out of the national nonprofit, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And the Main Street program remains as a part of the National Trust. And this grassroots approach to community redevelopment emphasizes a 4-point approach, which is economic vitality, design, again, to its core of preservation, organization, and promotion. And when executed successfully, it all results in community transformation. So by grounding our communities in the past and sense of place as an asset, then we can create vibrant, healthy downtowns and village centers, resulting in job creation, business growth, building rehab, and cultural enrichment. Here in Maine, the Maine Downtown Center which is part of the larger Maine Development Foundation, leads the charge for the Main Street program. As a fun side note, I like to mention that the Main Street program in Biddeford, Heart of Biddeford, recently won the Great American Main Street Award, which is a national award as the best Main Street program in the country, and that was in 2022. I think anyone who's recently visited downtown Biddeford can attest to the changes that have been happening, and it goes beyond the rehabilitation of buildings and beautification efforts. It takes real community building and action to keep and grow what we have, just like preservation. It doesn't just happen on its own. It takes people. The preservation movement emergence also aligned with the growing environmental movement, the green movement, as well as the oil crisis. So when we tear down buildings, we're not only filling up our dumps and landfills, but we're also wasting the embodied energy of those materials. Embodied energy is that energy we used and expended to fire the bricks, cast the iron, and haul the felled trees. So this historic fabric already has a carbon footprint, and we need to take that into account as we plan in our communities. Would we rather retain and rehabilitate existing buildings or tear them down and build new ones, expending more energy in some cases? Our position as preservationists has become even more sophisticated over the years, understanding the need to weatherize and modernize our historic buildings while still being sensitive to their architectural integrity. We've, in tandem with scientists and building engineers, we've also developed tools like CARE, which is the Carbon Avoided Retrofit Estimator. So this is a calculation that we can use that weighs the carbon emissions of building new buildings versus retrofitting the old. So that way we can actually, objectively use data and numbers to figure out, what is the carbon footprint of reusing this building and retrofitting it versus tearing it down and building new. And preserving significant sites and structures, as mentioned by one of those comments, is also one of the most effective ways of understanding and interpreting our past. But sometimes those places are no longer extant or purposely erased from the landscape. So through heritage preservation approach, we can take a wider look to preserving the stories that can't be told through precisely the places that they happened at. These often are the histories of people who lived on the margins of society and our old history books. We also must remember that heritage is a living concept, that the people and culture continue today. So for example, the National Park Service's National Heritage Area program highlights these significant regions where the culture and landscapes persist. Just like down East Maine, which was our state's only National Heritage Area, which was created just a few years ago, that highlights the rich history and ongoing heritage of the blueberry barrens, of the rich, sardine and fish packing industries, as well as the beautiful natural landscapes of the Bold Coast. So as our perceptions of preservation change and the ways we think about preservation, it also changes in some very technical ways. So what even qualifies as historic? And so through guidance by the National Park Service, which is really the federal agency that oversees a lot of our preservation programs, there's kind of a hard and fast rule of things that are 50 years old or older are typically, that's kind of the baseline of what could be historic. But if we quickly do the math together, that's 1974. And so I think that oftentimes can be shocking to some people. And that makes us think about different types of architecture. Picture here on the left is Boston City Hall, a brutalist structure built in 1969 that a lot of people think is outright ugly. And that's very much a subjective take, but it was very much a part and parcel of that era of construction, thinking about very stripped down details and buildings that served the civic good of a place. Closer to home here is Franklin Towers on the right, This was built in 1969 by the Portland Public Housing Authority, and was part of the urban renewal that created the Franklin Arterial. That was just listed to the National Register of Historic Places last year, recognizing its contribution in history to that era of efforts to build public housing. And so as we think about, again, defining what is historic, we have to turn to one of those tools that we do have in place, which is the National Register of Historic Places, and really is kind of the tool of figuring out what is historic and still historic. So the National Register of Historic Places is often the thing that people are talking about when they mention, is a building historic or designated historic, or is it in a historic district? Those are often references to the National Register of Historic Places. So it's our nation's official list of places that are worthy of preservation. It was created through the National Historic Preservation Act in 1966. So as I mentioned, that was really setting up the framework for what is preservation and how do we operate and practice. And at its core, it helps identify, document, and eventually designate places and sites that are of historic significance. So what even can be on the National Register? So, well, it's more than just buildings, actually. So obviously a building is a very easy concept to think about. A house, a downtown commercial building, a church. But there's also other types of things that can be listed, including structures. So think about maybe it's a historic steel fire tower that was erected in one of our state parks, or a significant windmill that was part of a sprawling farmstead. We can also list objects to the National Register. In this case, it takes a pretty wide approach. So pictured here is Steamboat Katahdin, which is actually listed on the National Register of Historic Places as an object. The Katahdin, or kind of informally known as Kate, was integral to the logging industry on Moosehead Lake, and you can still take tours on her today. Then there's also sites. These are kind of easy examples of thinking about maybe the Civil War battlefields that kind of dot the eastern half of our country. These are sites where significant events happened. And then lastly, districts. So this is, again, kind of can be a combination of all of the above. It could be a historic downtown like Kennebunk, which is a National Register Historic District, which could include things like a town green, which is a site rather than a building. So those are the types of things that can be listed to the National Register. But we also have to kind of evaluate why they're being listed. What is their significance? And for that, we turn to the criteria for consideration. And so while there's a lot of details we can go into, it kind of comes down to four main categories. So criterion A, which seems to be the most obvious, would be its significance to history, to the history of our country, to our state, to our local community. For example, not many 18th century houses remain in Maine, but those that do and retain their integrity could be listed as significant for its connection to the early settlement of a community by Europeans. So again, part of a larger historical trend that defined a certain region. Criterion B is that places significance to a person who has contributed to local, state, or national trends. For example, one of Maine's most prolific architects was John Calvin Stevens, based out of Portland, and one of the early contributors to the creation of shingle-style architecture. So again, his impact was not just in Maine, but across the country, and responsible for many summer cottages along our coast. So buildings that were designed by Stevens would be eligible if they retain their integrity, because of his significance and contributions to architecture writ large. But also buildings that were built by Stevens could be eligible for the next criterion C. And that's places that we recognize for their architecture or design or craftsmanship. So pictured here on the right is the Jean-Baptiste Daigel House in Fort Kent, Maine. This was built in 1864, and on the outside looks a pretty regular vernacular historic house from the 19th century. But if we look at its frame, it's actually a piece-on-piece horizontal plankboard structure. And this was a design and structural system that French Acadians used. So essentially plank boards stacked on top of each other to create a frame like a log cabin, but they were planks rather than logs. So sometimes you have to dig deeper to look for that certain significance. Oh, and I'll skip one there. And then criterion D, which is the potential of a place to yield information. And so preservationists don't really use this criteria very often. It's very much used by historic archaeologists and archaeologists who are studying pre-contact eras, so things that are in the ground. They know that those resources are there and they have the potential to yield significant information. So we have what types of things can be listed. We know why they would be listed, what's their significance. And then finally, the National Register also has to evaluate the integrity of that place. So again, it has to still be in some way intact. And so the National Register sets up kind of 7 areas of integrity, of how we evaluate if a place retains its integrity. So I'll use the McGlash and Nickerson House as an example, a late 19th century Italian home in Calais, Maine. This is one of our endangered properties in Maine. It's still slated for demolition. But if we were to evaluate for the National Register, which it is listed, first we look at its location. It hasn't moved from where it was built, so check. Its design, it features many elements of Italian architecture from the late 19th century. Many of those things have not been changed, like the double brackets in the eave, for example. Its setting, so it's set just along the St. Croix River. It still has its kind of green yards and surrounding trees, so its setting is intact. Material, it's a balloon frame structure, has beautiful double hung wood windows, beautiful woodwork inside and plaster. All those materials still persist. They have not been removed and changed. The workmanship, so those who put in the effort to construct the building, if all those materials are in place, obviously the workmanship needed to put them in place and construct it are still intact. And then the final 2 aspects of integrity are the ones that are very subjective and people kind of often argue about. So feeling and association. So does this late 19th century home near Red Beach in Calais, Maine, does it still give the sense of a historic building of that time? Can you still feel its association to this early settlement of an area? And so those are, again, how we evaluate if a building, a structure, a site, or even an object like Steamboat Katahdin retain its integrity. And so ultimately, I like to kind of reaffirm the National Register identifies and documents historically significant sites and places. And what does it do with that? So it enables local, state, and federal agencies to consider historic resources in the planning processes. So if you know which buildings and sites and places are significant, you know how to coordinate their existence and their integrity in that planning process. It provides review of federally funded or permitted work. So if we know a place is significant, federal funds need to take into account if any of that work or the permitted work will have an impact on those places. And finally, it unlocks eligibility for some financial support, whether that's grants for a nonprofit or historic rehabilitation tax credit, which are set aside for commercial income producing redevelopments of historic buildings. And then on the opposite side, what does the National Register of Historic Places not do? So it does not restrict the rights of private property owners to use, develop, or sell that property. It does not prevent demolition of that property. So the National Register is a primarily honorific designation. And what does come into effect if there are no local laws is that, again, if the federal government's going to use money to expand a highway, or install a new breakwater along the coast to protect the shoreline from waves. They have to take into consideration places that are on the National Register or eligible for the National Register. And finally, it does not guarantee financial support. So it unlocks it. So you still need to meet the requirements of those funding programs. And then relevant to Kennebunk, so we have the National Register of Historic Places, but then we also have these tools in Maine that can be implemented at the local level through local designation. So the Kennebunk Historic Preservation Ordinance was actually the first one in the state of Maine, passed in 1963. So it shows a very early concerted effort to preserve the historic fabric of Kennebunk. It allows for local designation. So it establishes a Historic Preservation Commission that oversees this ability to create historic districts or landmark individual buildings. Exterior alterations to these places require a COA or a certificate of appropriateness. And that's a review process that you have to go through with the Preservation Commission. And through that, the work and design of those alterations need to follow a set of design guidelines established by the Preservation Commission. So the Kennebunk Historic District, or Preservation Overlay, as it's more formally known, is made up of 113 contributing resources. 107 of those are buildings, with 6 of them sites, as well as 56 non-contributing resources or buildings. And so sometimes buildings are lost over the course of the years, probably before the district was created. And so non-contributing resources are those that have been altered over time, or maybe they're new construction that have been since infill into the district. So like the National Register, local designation or local historic districts also identify and document historically significant sites and places. It similarly enables local agencies to consider historic resources in planning. And where it does differ is it requires review and approval of alterations to designated buildings and sites, and the construction of new buildings in addition. So if there is a gap in a historic district, anything that does go in there to be constructed does need to be compatible with its historic surroundings. In some communities, local designation unlocks eligibility financial incentives. In some instances, in commercial downtown, they could have a program for facade grants or facade rehabilitation grants. So those are usually local dollars or federal dollars that set up a program that help incentivize repair and preservation of historic buildings. And then ultimately, local designation is where preservation really has its ability to protect places, protect historic resources. And through that, it stabilizes the investment of those who own property in those districts. And also it ensures a quality of design. So again, if a Historic Preservation Commission is reviewing an addition or new construction, they're able to, again, ensure that there's kind of the sense of continuity within an area. And so I wanted to kind of end today by just mentioning 2 local examples of preservation, particularly that's in the news in Kennebunk lately. And just kind of presenting them as things that are ongoing and may spur feelings about what is and is not preservation. So the Barnard Tavern, the 18th century tavern, is a contributing resource or a building to the National Register listed Kennebunk Historic District. Unfortunately, it was demolished last year following a very long process that all very much happened at that local level that we just discussed, which involved review by the Historic Preservation Commission, conflicting reports from engineers, and ultimately as well a town vote. Preservation projects include an added layer of complexity from the redevelopment of newer buildings and sites, and this is certainly no exception. So a reconstruction of the tavern will be erected on site, at least as kind of shared in news reports. using some of the salvage material from the original building. And another example in Kennebunk is the wedding cake house. And so I think we can all agree that this is probably one of the most well-known or identifiable buildings probably in southern Maine. So the federal-style brick house was built in 1826 for George W. Bourne, but it was his 1855 edition of elaborate Gothic revival trim that made it a true architectural standout in the state, and also I would probably argue in New England. The Wedding Cake House is a good example of how we help property owners as a nonprofit. Community members and local leaders maneuver through decisions surrounding how a historic building is preserved, how it's preserved, used, and ultimately stewarded into the future. This house demands an exceptionally high level of care given its ornate woodwork, making a commercial use make sense. That the costs will be high, and therefore there may need to be a sustainable source of funds to support that. But kind of on the other side, a commercial use also raises concerns about a commercial use in its context, in its current neighborhood. And then from a preservation standpoint, it also kind of a more intense commercial use means probably a higher threshold for compliance with life and safety codes, which may require intervention into the building, kind of destroying some of the historic fabric in order to make sure that that building is safe for its intended uses. And so I think with those two examples, I think ultimately preservation is a complex a process that we all must go through, particularly in our line of work, weighing the pros and cons. But ultimately, preservation to us is kind of a foot on the brake. Making sure that we're preserving these historic places while also allowing for progress into the future. And with that, I will end my presentation and gladly welcome any questions and potentially see if that even leads into any kind of discussion. But thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Brad. I have just allowed everyone, if they want to, unmute themselves and turn their videos. If they do want to ask questions to Brad. In the meantime, I'll feed you some from the chat that came through while you were presenting. Barbara, in responding to your first question about what values does historic preservation provide your community, Barbara mentioned maintaining our stewardship and helping to move to the future and inclusion while not dismissing the past.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that's so much of what preservation is. Oftentimes we try to dispel the myth that preservation is all about the past, but it's very much a way to look into the future. What are the places that we want to preserve to keep around for the next generation? And for what reasons are we doing that? Is it to preserve a place so that we can best tell its story? Are we preserving it because it's an important economic asset to our community? Or is a historic neighborhood important to retain because of its sense of place and its walkability to downtown and the beautiful trees that line the street? So yeah, I can't agree more.
Bruce asked during your presentation, I think we did see an image on a slide earlier, but he was wondering how many buildings or sites are in Kennebunk and Kennebunkport are on the National Register, and what are they?
That's a good question. So what numbers I do have readily available are how many buildings are locally designated.
Okay.
And so that the historic overlay includes 107 contributing buildings to the overlay, the district, at the local level. At the national level, I'd have to check, but I think the local district is very similar to the national district, and then there's also several individual landmarks, like the Lord Mansion, for example. That was the first property in the Kennebunks listed to the National Register, I think in 1973.
And a follow-up question from Bruce, are there any Indigenous peoples sites listed?
That's a great question. I'd have to check the National Register. I'm guessing there's no Indigenous sites listed at the local level, but at the national level through the National Register of Historic Places, it's possible that there are sites that could be listed. Again, it either could be probably through criteria A, which is its association with history of a place. It could also be a criterion D for its potential to yield information. So if it was an archaeological site, but those are definitely worth checking out, and I'd be happy to help identify those. Several places in Maine, for example, that are on the National Register or at least recognized potentially by the state too as a historic site are shell middens, which are pretty tangible part of Indigenous culture that still remain on our landscape.
Yeah. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to unmute yourself, show your videos, and please ask now. Ask Brad some questions if you have any.
I do see that someone else mentioned interested to know if there's any main cases of using the CARE tool, so kind of evaluating whether to preserve a building or demolish it and build new based on carbon footprint. I'm not aware of anybody kind of weighing those decisions. I think fortunately there's a pretty strong ethic of preservation in Maine. And in those places where there is a lot of development pressure, at least our urban centers, there are the tools at the local level through historic designation that have, through ordinance, required retention and rehabilitation of historic buildings. But it doesn't mean everything is safe, for sure.
Barbara made a comment. Our latest National Registry survey update had listed more buildings as many are carriage house or barns in addition to homes themselves.
See if I understand the comment.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think I'll take a big approach or response to that. So since the National Register Historic District in Kennebunk was one of the earlier ones, developed in the 1970s, a lot of those earlier districts and nominations, there's an application form you fill out with all the information, the historic information about each building and its architectural description. A lot of the early ones were very Spartan. And so I think it's really important for communities to go back, like what it sounds like here in Kennebunk, is to resurvey buildings to make sure that we're capturing a lot more information, a lot more buildings, including outbuildings like carriage houses and barns, which have a real potential for accessory dwelling units for increasing density in our communities without having to build new. That's very relatable to the legislation LD 2003 that passed just a few years ago, supporting density in our historic cores. But also to the question of we need to resurvey because more buildings are passing that 50-year mark. And so sometimes buildings are left out, and that means their story is not captured or they're not eligible for the financial incentives. And so we really need to focus on identification and documentation. It's an ongoing process. It's just not something that happened and is done.
I have a question. Do you know of any instances or criteria for a site in Maine to actually be removed from the National Registry?
Yes. So I should mention that the the state agency that oversees the National Register of Historic Places in Maine is the Maine Historic Preservation Commission. And so each state and territory has one of those, as well as federally recognized tribes have a tribal historic preservation office. And so that commission meets quarterly, and at least once a meeting a year, they do go through a list of buildings and sites that have been delisted. Oftentimes those are things that are lost to fire, sometimes to demolition, or things that may have been improperly listed. But a lot of things with preservation, you know, we have a lot of work to do with fewer resources and staff, and therefore that kind of subtraction of designations doesn't happen very often. But yes, it can happen. And to my earlier point that the National Register doesn't prevent you from doing anything to your property, that's true. But if you were to alter it to a certain degree, you do risk it being delisted, which could again prevent you from. I mean, not only is it destroying historically significant place, but it could preclude you from a financial incentive at the end of the day.
Okay. Another question. What inspired you to work in the field of historic preservation?
Yeah, well, how much time do you have? No, I think, as I mentioned, I studied history in school, and I very much felt that needing to preserve place is essential to telling those stories, because they are such, you know, visceral parts of our communities and our states. So I think that's a big part of it. But once getting into preservation, I talked about how it's just not this static thing. It requires action. It requires people. And so getting the chance to work with nonprofits who have assembled to save historic mill building, or if it's a Main Street organization, you know, wanting to develop financial tools for their small business owners. Preservation is very much an action with people that people who care about their communities and their sense of place and their history and their past and their future. And so that's inspiring to work with, and that gets you through the day.
That's great. Thank you so much. I realized that I had everyone in focus mode. So if that had stopped anyone from actually being able to unmute themselves before, I apologize. This is our first video series, so we're ironing out some kinks. So we appreciate your guys' patience. If anyone does have any last questions for Brad before we wrap this up, please feel free. Again, I apologize about the inability to turn on your microphones until now.
Well, without jumping ahead of anybody, I will say if questions come to you as you're thinking about all of this and processing what Brad has talked about, certainly there's plenty of resources online. MainePreservation.org is one place that you can start in order either to get in touch with Brad. I don't know, Brad, I'm sure you field questions all the time, and you will be happy to do that. Then, of course, the Brickstore Museum has resources at the local level, as does the Town of Kennebunk's Historic Commission as well, which you can find their information on the Kennebunk Town website. So resources all around. Feel free to reach out to any of us, and we'd be happy to help anybody. And with that, I think I'm going to thank Deb for coordinating all of this series today, and then our following ones. And of course, thank you to Brad for filling us in on the origins of the historic preservation movement and what it's doing today. So thank you very much. And I'm sure there's a silent round of applause, but anyone, if you'd like to leave a message for Brad, you're welcome to do that.
much. Yeah, and yeah, mainepreservation.org. You can find our staff page. It has all of our emails.
Perfect.
Feel free to send questions. And we really do answer any question about old buildings. And if we can't answer it, we know who to send you to.
Perfect. That's always the best part. So everyone, thank you so much once again for joining us for this lunch and learn, and we will hopefully see you next month. Thanks, everybody.